So our application's working pretty darn well. We can see a list of posts, we can navigate to one, we can delete it if we want, we can navigate back around, we can add a post, we can cancel, everything that you would expect out of a normal blogging program like this. I want to take just a second to cover some of the high points about this application, specifically some of the more confusing ones. First, let's talk about ReactRouter and what it did for us. ReactRouter took over the process of figuring out what components needed to be rendered on the screen at any given time. It did this by taking a look at the current URL and then referencing that with our routes that we defined inside of routes.js. We defined a couple different routes. First off, we always said, always show the app component. That was our very core container of the entire application. App had just one job. It would show any children component. So whenever we navigated to some nested component, like say post/new or post/ID, that component would be passed into app, and then app would render that component in addition to itself. Whenever a user navigated to just /, we used the index route helper to make sure that we showed the post index component. The index route is showed whenever we navigate to just / right here. Next, we made sure that we made use of ReactRouter by displaying ReactRouter in place of our app component where we had it previously inside of our index.js file right here. We defined router and also passed in our routes configuration object in addition to the browser history object. The browser history just says, hey, use the entire URL whenever you're trying to figure out where you are. If we wanted, we could also use the hash history object, which is very similar, just slightly different in that it uses everything to the right, of a hash in the URL to figure out where it currently is. Next, we defined a handful of action creators. There weren't a lot of surprises here. A lot of them were just normal API requests, very similar to how we've made before. The only difference was that this time around, we also did a post request and a delete request in here so that we could actually make changes to our remote data. But overall, this is a lot of stuff that we'd already worked with before. Next, our reducer. Again, our post reducer was pretty darn similar to what we've seen before. We just had two pieces of state, a all, which contained all of our posts, but keep in mind that those posts did not contain the content property. And then we also had a single individual post, kind of the active post, if you will. We then made three different containers: index, new, and show. Index was responsible for showing data to the user, or a list of all of the blog posts. The one interesting thing about index was that it loaded its data as soon as it knew that it was about to be rendered to the DOM by placing the action creator inside of component will mount. So whenever we were about to render this to the DOM, the component would automatically attempt to go in and fetch its own data for itself. Once this component was showing a list of blog posts, we were able to navigate to an individual blog post by using the link tag provided by ReactRouter. The link tag is used just like any other component, and it really produces just a normal anchor tag on the page. There wasn't too much else going on inside of index.js. This is a pretty straightforward component. Next, post.show. This one was probably the second most difficult component we did right after index. So again, this was another component that fetched its own data. And the one twist here was that it needed a parameter out of the URL to figure out what individual post it wanted to fetch. This component was also in charge of deleting posts. And we made sure that after a user successfully deleted a post, we would navigate them back to the index route. Finally, posts new. This was definitely the most confusing component that we put together in this entire section, mostly because it used a lot of new different concepts. First, we included our link tag, we had ReduxForm, and thirdly, we also had our context for navigating our user around the application programmatically. One of the most interesting aspects of this component was ReduxForm. Remember, at the bottom, we set up some configuration for this form. Specifically, we named the form and then we told it which fields it was going to be in charge of. We also defined a validation function. Then, for each of our different fields that we defined, we created an input or a text area in the case of the content, and we made sure that we passed in the field's configuration object provided by ReduxForm. That made sure that ReduxForm was 100% in charge of handling all the changes and events emitted from this input right here. We also used ReduxForm for handling validation. Specifically, we made sure that we showed an error, if it existed, for each individual input only after the user had interacted with the input in some fashion. Finally, we made sure that we highlighted the entire form and the error message, or excuse me, the entire field and its error message red if the user had touched it and if the particular field was not valid, if it hadn't passed validation. So this was definitely a pretty confusing little component right here, but the good news is that everything that we did in here is almost 100% reproducible whenever you create your own form. You're always going to end up having very similar structure. You'll define the name of your form, the fields, you'll define your validation function, and then you just need to make sure that you connect ReduxForm with the individual form inputs. Not too bad. Okay, so I think this has been a fantastic little application. It was a little bit plain in terms of the visuals and functionality, but I think that we did a really good job of highlighting the high points of ReduxRouter and specifically ReduxForm as well. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you learned a lot out of this section.